So chapter 10 is actually a continuation of the previous one. Now I want to start where we stopped last time. And we stopped at the covenant with David. And today we're going to make sure, today and the next time, maybe the next two times, that you understand. Since the covenant of David, you have three persons, three big figures in Israel. And you need to keep that in your mind. In addition to the place and the time, you need those three people. The prophet, because he's the beginning of everything. This since Moses started, you're going to have a line of prophets. The next prophet after Moses was, you can say Deborah. You can say Deborah. She was called the prophetess. But who is the big prophet after Moses? Who is the one that was very powerful and his story was given in details? Think, a prophet. A person who speaks on behalf of God, who God comes to him at night and whisper in his ears. Call him by name. Samuel. So the next line, the next one after Moses will come Samuel. And after Samuel will come Nathan and Gad. And then you're going to start a big rush of prophets. Isaiah, Hosea, Amos, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all these prophets. I'm not saying them in order. This is a line of prophets that will be the communication port for God. This is where God actually is going to speak in a microphone. Who he is going to speak to? Since Samuel was the last one to speak just to the people. But then after he finished, the new line of prophets will be speaking to who mainly? To the second person, which is the king. They call those the royal prophets because their main job is guiding the king. We saw this in Nathan coming to David. Remember how Nathan acted with David? David says, Nathan, come here. I need to tell you something. I'm excited in building a house for God. And Nathan gets excited and says, oh, go, do whatever you want. God is with you. And what happens at night? What did you say? And I didn't tell you to tell Nathan this. And God gives his covenant to David. From that time on, prophets are going to be royal prophets. They say there are three types of prophets. Three types. There is the ecstatic prophets. Ecstatic. This is a side note. You're not going to find it in your notes. Ecstatic prophets is those who are like charismatic. They are like going into prayer and they go into trance and they get, filled or possessed by the Spirit of God. And they speak things and they say things. They call them ecstatic. And there is itinerant, means going around, prophets. These are like in the time of Elijah. Elijah had started a school for itinerant prophets. Those are people who live in a community like monks, and they are actually taught and trained to teach people and to pray. That's why Elijah is known for establishing the prophets of the Carmel, Mount Carmel. And then people took that tradition from them, and now we have Catholic branch of monks and nuns. They call them the Carmelite nuns, and they are following that same idea of the itinerant prophets. What's the third one? The royal prophets. These are learned people. Those first two, maybe the first one, the ecstatic prophets, are actually illiterate. They cannot write or read, but they have this. They exert themselves into prayers until they go into a trance. They go into an ecstasy, and they start. This is what happened to Saul. And the itinerant prophets is more of a lifestyle training that they get trained under a great prophet like Elijah. And the third type is the royal prophets are learned people who will end up writing books. The major one of them is that we know the big ones is Isaiah, Jeremiah. You might have also Ezekiel. These are big figures who wrote books that you actually can read their prophecies written down and documented. Not only their prophecies, but they're also historians. They wrote most of the history books of the Bible. So those are the three types of prophets I want you to keep in mind. This is the first person. What's the second office? We said the king, the leader, the political and military leader of the nation, of the kingdom. And the third person, which is very much tied to the king also, the prophet. The prophet is above the king. And there's also the high priest, because the king and the temple was very much linked in the covenant. This is important. I'll tell you why. Because The covenant was given to David. We're going to look at this again. So the temple, and God had made the choice that the temple should actually be in the city of the king, in Jerusalem. We're going to look into that. So the king palace and the temple were in the same place, which is very strange because it meant, listen to this, it's very important. You break away from the king, you're breaking away from the temple and from God. Because once God made the temple, made a covenant with David, it was that. That's it. Do you call that? You can say theocracy if you want. It's not really, because the king is not the godly figure here. Who is the godly figure? Who is the spokesperson? So there is a prophet. And this created checks and balances. The king cannot do whatever he wants because there is a prophet on top of him that will actually tell him, you're wrong. And it ends up by the death of the king. No, before the king dies, who dies first? Usually. What does the common saying say? Kill the messenger. Who is the messenger? The prophet, not the king. So when the king gets angry with the prophet and doesn't know what to do, what they do? They kill the prophet. That's why Jesus came to say, which of the prophets you had not killed? Tell me about one prophet that you did not really end up destroying. So sometimes the king will be a godly king and listen to the prophet. And sometimes the king would be an evil king. We're going to see one of them actually doing very much opposite to everything God saw. So the second person is the king. And the third person is the high priest, which represents the temple and represents the service in the temple. So you have the three persons, the three offices, the prophet, the king, and the high priest. And these three offices are tied up, locked up in the covenant with David. We get that? So by God making a covenant with David, we're going to look into this. God made promises in this covenant and swore an oath to David. But in that covenant, he mentions the temple. Who speaks the covenant? The prophets. Who is the officer responsible for keeping the covenant? Is both the three of them. But the prophet ends up being the one to stand alone if it needs be. So let's go and look at this. What are the implications of the covenant with David? That's the first question. How did the kingdom divide? And who are the kings in the line of David? So we're going to look into those three questions in this episode. This covers First Kings, Second Kings, major and most of minor prophets. But we're not going to do this today. The major and minor prophets will be next time. Let's go into the covenant with the king and the temple and the prophets. There's two citations here I got from the Bible. One of them is from the Psalms. This psalm, the second one is a psalm. When you see it, you will know that's a very familiar psalm. In the covenant with David, God said to him through Nathan, when your days be fulfilled and you shall sleep with your fathers, means after you die, I will set up your seed after you, which shall proceed out of your own flesh, from your own belly, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Notice here he's saying when this is going to happen. Be smart now. This is tricky. This person that he speaks about is going to come after David's death, right? Not too many kings enthroned their kids when they were alive. There are only two I can remember. David put Solomon in his throne while David was alive. At the end of his time, he was very old. Who is the second one? Was not by his choice. Was King Uzziah, and he had to let go of the kingdom to his son Jotham because he got sick. But these are the two kings. But he's talking here, the prophecies about the king will come in the future after David dies. So when you tell me it's Solomon, I'm going to tell you, even the rabbis, the Jewish people, understood this verse to talk about the Messiah, the son of David. They were waiting for him. They knew from that time that he was speaking about somebody else who's going to establish the kingdom of God, and it will be forever. So that's why when we come to the New Testament and say, and his kingdom shall have no end, we know where this is coming from. Okay? So just remember that after he shall sleep, which means what? Die. That from your line comes someone, that this is a prophecy about the Messiah. The second verse speaks about an oath, God swearing. What did we say? One of the conditions of the covenant? Swearing an oath. So here it is. The Lord swore an oath to David, a sure oath he will not revoke. He will not break it. One of your own descendants I will place on your throne if your sons keep my covenant and the statutes I teach them. Then their sons shall sit on your throne forever and ever. He's talking about the Messiah again, but this time he's talking about the covenant. God established a covenant with David that included the following promises. One, God will establish the line of David as the line of kings over Israel forever. That's the first one. He said, which is something big. You think about it. A human being who is a shepherd, a little boy, God takes from the sheep and says, I want you to be the king of my people. And then after that, he says, you know what? Not only that, I'm going to make you, your line, your name will be forever. That forever people will remember David as the line of the king. The second promise he made, God will give David a son after David's death who will build the house of God. This promise was fulfilled partially in Solomon, and not really completely, because Solomon was enthroned while David was alive, who reigned while David was still alive. It was fulfilled completely in Christ, who came 1,000 years after David's death. Remember the timing? I said from Abraham to Moses is how many years? So we say how many years before Christ Abraham came? 2,000 years. So let's go this way from left to right. 2,000 years. And then Moses, 1,500 years. Then David, 1,000 years. Exile, 500 years. So every 500 is something major happening. So 2,000 years is Abraham. 1,500 years is Moses, the covenant with Moses. 1,000 years is David. 500 years is exile, then come Christ. The third promise he makes in that covenant, the temple shall be built and maintained by the royal line, which meant God is taking it personally. You're going to break away from the Davidic line and you want nothing to do with the king. You're actually breaking away from the relationship with God. Basically, that's how they understood it. God had tied himself to David so much that it was impossible to leave David without leaving God. So what if the kings under David, his children, are evil? What if they're not good, actually? They're worshiping idols. What am I supposed to do? That's a very good question, right? And it's going to happen. So what if the church bishops and pope are evil? They're actually ungodly, like it happened in the medieval times. What should we do? What is the church to do? What are the regular pious people who love God very much to do? This is a question given to this and the history, and you need to study it so you understand what happened. This history is going to show you it's not a theoretical question. This is actually a real question, because since God had tied himself to David very much in his line, what will happen if the Davidic line goes sour, bad, corrupted? We'll see. This covenant implied a tight relationship between the prophets, the kings, and the high priest. These three offices will continue throughout the rest of the history of Israel. We are going to study the relationship between the three offices. Why the three offices? Because when Jesus comes, he's going to be what? Which one is he going to be out of those? The three. In him, we have the king, because he's a line of David. We have the priest that's likened to Melchizedek, whose lasting, his priesthood will be forever. And he is the prophet like Moses that the people had waited for. He is the three. He is the prophet. He is the King of Kings. He is the high priest. So very important that you understand those three offices is established in the covenant with David, was prophesied about before.